I'm Emma-Louise Coffey and you're welcome to The Dairy Edge, the Teagasc Dairy podcast. We're bringing you the latest information, insights and opinion to improve dairy farm performance. On this week's episode of The Dairy Edge podcast, John O'Connell from County Leitrim gives us the farmer experience of contract rearing. But first, advisor Tom Coll explains the evolution of contract rearing as a profitable enterprise in the Northwest.
The group was formed in 2015 across Sligo and Leitrim. So we currently have 19 farmers rearing over 2,000 dairy heifers. The numbers reared in individual farms ranges from where John started off at 30 heifers up to some of the more established farms where they're rearing up to 300 heifers. The age at which the heifers arrive on the farm varies. Some lads are rearing them from 3 weeks of age. Some farmers prefer to get them in weaned 12 weeks, and others get them in at 9 months of age. Initially, some members have summer grazed heifers before moving on to longer term contracts. In general, most contracts consist of one owner rearing for one dairy, or one rearer rearing for one dairy farmer, but we have some rearers that rear for more than one dairy farmer, and we have some dairy farmers who engage more than one rearer to rear the heifers for them.
And I guess, just briefly in terms of the cost, is there a massive cost difference if you're taking a heifer calf in at 3 weeks age, compared to 12 weeks of age? Yeah,
but if you look at the costings, the main costings to rear a heifer are the ones that were produced at Moor Park and at Ballyhaise, and that's somewhere around €1,550, including that's the value of the calf herself. So there's 5 stages of rearing that heifer. The 2 costliest stages are the initial stage up to weaning and the second winter. So most of our lads are rearing the heifers the other 3 stages, which is the first summer grass, the first winter housing period, and the second summer grass. So there's a big variation whether you're taking the animals in at the other 2 stages, or the 3 maybe least cost stages.
And just moving on then and picking up on another point that you mentioned, some rearers have heifer calves from more than one farm. Is that a challenge, in terms of disease risk and performance among the different farmers?
Yeah, of course it is. And it's not something that probably not a lot of farmers doing it. But with the scale that some dairy or rearers are at now, unless they can get matched up from a very big dairy farmer, then they probably have to take in from more than one dairy farmer. So the first stage there is to talk to the DVO. The biggest challenge, I suppose, is TB and movements. But they should also do a plan with their own local vet, and the dairy farmer should also be doing a plan with his local vet as well as to vaccinations and what the disease risks are there from numerous diseases that's out there. So a good vaccination program can cover a lot of those areas. And
then if we look at the discussion group, I know typically in a lot of dairy discussion groups, the first 15 or 20 minutes, there's a whip around discussing current milk yield, grass figures. What sort of things do you discuss at a contract rearing discussion group?
Well, a lot of our topics are based on getting those heifers reared basically as economically as possible. Again, farmers adopting technology, and I suppose we're in an area where the farms are mainly heavy farms, but with the lighter animals, we can look at getting increasing the number of days of grass, paddock systems, best utilising grass. Farmers will be focused in on making top quality silage, and we're not talking about 70, 72 DMD silage, we're talking about 75, 76, 78 DMD silage, and that's what they're currently making, to carry those heifers through the winter as economically as possible. But like dairy groups, there would be a whip round, these lads are very interested in the growth rates, so they do regular weigh-ins, and we can look at those at group meetings. We can look at scanning results, various the general topics that on any topic related with achieving the targets. The targets are we have explained we have visited dairy farms and looked at why the targets are so important to the overall lifetime performance of those heifers going onto those farms. So the lads in the group are very aware of why they need to hit the targets, and the repercussions that can have for the lifetime performance of the heifers if they don't hit.
And when we look at John's situation, John O'Connell is extremely positive about his farm business and the impact of contract rearing on his farm business. What are the challenges from the rearer's perspective that you see across the group?
Yeah, the main challenge, the main overriding point that most of the group members would say was maybe a stumbling block was looking at the heifers when they come in first on the farms. Like, there will be a certain percentage of them, be it 10-20%, that are under target when they get them in the first place. So for a lot of those farmers, we kind of say it's like walking a tightrope. Like, they have to trust the dairy farmer that he put enough beastings into that animal in the first hour or two of his life, that animal didn't get sick in the first 6 or 8 or 10, 12 weeks of his life, didn't get an outbreak of pneumonia, which he might be running on half a lung, and that just won't perform, so it's a kind of step in the dark, and it's trust, but that trust builds up over a time period. And for some of the rearers have got to the stage that, those bottom 10% of heifers coming in, there'll probably be a different target for those, or maybe that bottom 10% won't arrive on the farm at all, because our lads are in the rearing group are encouraged to go and look at the heifers before they actually come onto the farm, visit the dairy farm, and the dairy farm will visit the contract rearer's farm as well.
You mentioned the contract rearers are in Leitrim, Sligo area. Where are the heifers coming from?
So the heifers are coming from Louth, Meath, Roscommon, Longford, Mayo, and as far south as Cork and Kilkenny.
And I guess, is there scope to increase? You mentioned they're rearing in excess of 2,000 heifers currently. Is there scope on these farms to increase their heifer rearing capacity, and are there more in the Sligo Leitrim area looking to rear heifers?
Yeah, there's more farmers looking to get into contract rearing, so the demand for heifers far exceeds the supply.
And finally, just to pick up, a lot of people talk about the importance of the contract. How important is it for you?
Yeah, the contract is critical. Like, the two farmers sit down with an intermediary person, and they cover all possibilities. Like, nobody wants to, when they meet up first, nobody wants to talk about if an animal dies, or what happens in that case, or animals don't hit the targets. So they have to set the targets. They weigh-in targets, how often the animals are weighed, when they're vaccinated, when their AI starts, if they're using a heat synchronization program, who supplies AI straws, basically the important one, what the rates are. So even as down as far as animal insurance. So every aspect has to be covered in that contract, and the two farmers have to agree on it. And that's a very good starting point if they agree on it. But an intermediary needs to be with them when they're drawing up the contract as well. If things obviously there's going to be a bump on the road, and generally that occurs in the first year, and how you get over that bump, that's where the intermediary plays his part.
And as you say, being able to fall back on a good contract that includes all aspects of the contract rearing process, will cover that, and if you can fall back on it. That's great. Thank you, Tom. So John, can you give us an outline of the evolution of your farm from where you've come to, from starting off on day one to where you are today?
Yeah, so basically I started farming in the mid to late 80s, took over the farm from my father. We were milking 30 cows, 35 cows, and rearing all calves right through. The farm, more or less the same acreage, has been farmed all through the years, and that hasn't changed at all. But I continued milking for around 10 to 12 years, and after that, because of quota restrictions and land restrictions, I decided that milking wasn't for me. So the cows went in roughly 99-2000, and then I went into suckler cows. Suckler cows worked for 5-10 years, and more or less after 10 years, when I sat down and done the profit monitor for 3 years consecutively with my local Teagasc advisor, I realised that the small number of sheep I had on a per hectare basis were leaving me an awful lot more money than the suckler cows. So the suckler cows had to go, and what was killing me there was the long winters, heavy ground, heavy continental suckler cows. That wasn't working. So roughly in 2012, 2013, the suckler cows went and moved up in numbers. I moved up in sheep numbers from 80 ewes up to 240 ewes, and that's where I sat until 2015, where I went into the contract rear, and then in 2015.
And I guess, you've made a lot of changes moving from dairy into Drystock and then back into dairy again with the contract rearing. How hard or difficult did you find that decision?
It was relatively easy, the transition going from basically with the sheep going into the contract rearing. That wasn't a major issue. There was very little expenditure in that regard because a lot of the buildings were there, and it was in some ways that's why the contract rearing suited so much, because the buildings were there. I had moved up obviously in your numbers. That was costly, moving up in your numbers, and sheds had to be rearranged and facilities had to be organised in order to move up in sheep numbers. That was definitely an issue. But to go from the contract rearing, it wasn't a problem because all the sheds were there in place. There was lots of housing available, and I suppose that's how I got into the contract rearing, in that I couldn't expand any more in sheep numbers without investing heavily in more sheds for sheep. There was sheds there suitable for cattle, and it was a no-brainer to try and give it a go. So that's how the contract rearing started for me.
And where did the idea of contracting for your farm come from?
Well, it was an idea, a suggestion from my Teagasc advisor. We were at 240 ewes. I didn't want to go back into suckler cows. I was utilising more grass. I was growing more grass. Between being involved with pasture base, I could see I was able to grow the grass and I was utilising it. So I had all this excess grass. I didn't want to go up in ewe numbers. The sheds were there, they were available. There wasn't going to be a big expenditure, and basically my local Teagasc advisor said maybe we should give this a shot and we can go and work on that, and that's how it started, the contract rearing.
And talk through how it has worked for you for the last few years. Has it been a positive move for your overall farm business?
Without a shadow of a doubt. I wouldn't go back, and if it was a case that the contract rearing option wasn't there in the morn, it wouldn't be that I'd go back to sucklers. Definitely not. The beef end of it wouldn't suit. There was a little bit apprehensive when I started into it, definitely, because you're basically looking after someone else's cattle. Now, I had been involved for the last 20 years in a small bit of B&B cattle in the sheds, so I was used to looking after somebody else's cattle. So maybe for me it was a little bit easier in that I was used to having a certain number of cattle during the winter months and looking after them for someone else. But definitely you're taking on someone else's future heifers, and these are high index heifers. They're very, very valuable heifers. You want to make sure you do the thing right. Like when I got into it and when the heifers arrived the very first day, I must have looked at them 10, 12 times in the shed to make sure they were all right. But once you settle into it, and after a few weeks, and any of the guys that have went into it would say the same thing, once you settle into it, it's not an issue, you get used to it, and it more or less, it sits very well for me with the sheep. It works well with it,
And in terms of the farm business, what are the important things that drive, I suppose, the performance of the animals and profitability for you?
The first thing that springs to mind is good grassland management and top quality silage. If you haven't got that, apart from infrastructure, obviously fencing and paddocks and being able to organise your paddocks properly, that's back to your grassland management. But if you haven't got that in place, you're not going to be successful at it. You want to get that part right so as you can try and minimise concentrate costs. If you have to be putting a lot of concentrates into them, basically you won't be making any money out of it, and that's the bottom line. And
then you're a member of Tom's discussion group. Talk through how that has benefited you on the contract rearing journey.
So I was involved actually from more or less the inception of the contract rearing group. I got involved in the very beginning because we actually met up with a guy that had been contract rearing for since 2010. And so myself and maybe one or two other guys, along with Tom, went to meet this guy, and that's more or less our first meeting with it. That's how the group started. Now the group has grown to 20 farmers, and we're all actively contract rearing heifers. It's great. We meet up 4 or 5 times a year. We host a meeting on somebody's farm within the group. We throw out ideas, problems we might have encountered during the year, what's working for one guy and not working for somebody else. There's in some ways you could say there's a competitive nature involved in it to a certain extent. It's interesting to see how some other guy is doing it, and you think, well, if he can achieve them targets, maybe I should be achieving them targets too. But it's very healthy. Like the discussions we have, very, very good. And like regardless of when we go to a meeting or when the discussion takes place, we'll always bring something home from it,
And my final question then to you, John. What are the most important elements that you included in your contract with the dairy farmer?
So one thing that's very important, that the heifers come in on target. That's important. We draw up a health plan, so we do that with the farmer, and there has to be a mediator there, someone that will be prepared to, in case there's any problems. It's very important to draw up a written contract. You don't need a solicitor, it doesn't have to be that fancy, but it's important to have a written contract to safeguard both yourself and the dairy farmer. Targets are important. How often during the year the heifers are going to be weighed, who pays the costs of vaccines, AI in the heifers, dosing the heifers, weighing the heifers, any costs that are involved during the year, who pays for them? Does he pay for this or that? How often does he come down to look at the heifers? Does he have to give me notice of before he comes down to look at the heifers? Have we decided on conception rates, whether there should be 90% in calf after the first 3 weeks, or whether they use a bull or not? If the bull has been used, does he provide the bull? If we're AIM for the first 3 weeks, if we're going to synchronise them, who pays for that? So there's a lot of different things to be taken into account that way. But all of that is written into the contract, and the contract is there. It's more or less a template, but you can deviate from it a little bit, but it's there to safeguard both parties, and it's crucially important to have that in place.
Excellent. So just to recap on that, the really important elements would be, I suppose, what's included in terms of the costs, who pays for what, and then set targets, and it might be target weight or conception rates in terms of fertility. That's great. Thank you, John.
Lovely.
That's it for this week's episode of the Dairy Edge podcast, and my thanks to Tom Coll and John O'Connell for joining me on this week's show. Don't forget to subscribe on Apple and Google Podcasts, as well as Spotify, and for more information go to the Teagasc website at teagasc.ie. I'm Emma-Louise Coffey, and join me next time for your Dairy Edge.